My name's Ossian. I'm from UniResolution. I wanted to start off by talking about what is unfair treatment. If you've experienced it, you definitely know what it is. However, I'm going to talk about how it's defined and work through some examples. So, to begin, how do you work out if you've been unfairly treated? And in later videos, I'll look at what you can do about it. So, unfair treatment. It's where, because of the action or inaction of a university or college, you've been treated poorly or you've been treated in a way that's not in line with the proper procedure. So in plain language, it means you weren't treated like everyone else and the university or college didn't follow their rules. Now, fairness isn't about the outcome you want. It's about not being treated consistently. It's about not being treated with respect, not being treated with fairness. So if a decision that affects you was made without giving the opportunity for you to be heard, or if you were judged by a different standard to others, these are examples of unfair treatment. So for example, if you're given a lower mark than your classmates and you just can't justify why, it could be that this is a form of unfair treatment because you've been judged by different criteria to other people. Now, you may suspect bias, whether conscious or not, and that's going to be a red flag. Or for example, imagine you're accused of misconduct or you're facing disciplinary procedures. In this type of situation, there's very clear processes that should be followed, and if they're not followed, then that's going to be grounds for saying the process is unfair. And so every student has the right to be heard, and if that hasn't happened, then that's going to be grounds for making a complaint or putting in an appeal. Now, unfair treatment can also involve discrimination. So that's when you're being treated differently based upon a protected characteristic. So race, sex, disability, age. But also it could be, for example, an international student who isn't given the opportunity to participate in a research project because of assumptions made about their language ability. Now, that's not just unfair, it can be discriminatory. And so these types of unfair processes and unfair decision making can also involve harassment. So for example, if a staff member or a student treats you differently because of a protected characteristic, this can also amount to discrimination. But sometimes unfair treatment isn't just personal bias, but it's the university or college not delivering what they promised. So for example, the course description may be different from what you actually experienced, or support services were never provided. Information in the prospectus is different. So these obligations that are in handbooks and in contracts need to be followed. And if they are not followed, then you've got grounds to say that's unfair treatment. So, with poor quality facilities or lack of support from an academic advisor, these can count as unfair treatment as well, because it can distort your education. Now, unfair treatment can also occur even before you enroll. So, for example, an admissions decision in which procedures weren't followed. A local applicant with identical credentials was admitted, but the international applicant wasn't, and there's no reasons to explain why that happened. So that kind of mishandling of paperwork can be grounds to appeal against this unfairness. Now, talking about all of these examples of unfair treatment, you've got to also keep in mind that not everything we dislike is going to be unfair. So, for example, universities and colleges have discretion in relation to academic judgment. So getting a difficult, result, a tough grade, that's not automatically going to be unfair, because the grade needs to be based on something other than your performance. So if the criteria wasn't applied, if the rules were different for you than for other people, this kind of inequality or incorrect decision making can be challenged, but the actual academic decision itself isn't generally going to be open to challenge. So being upset about a decision or a result isn't enough. You need to make the argument that that process itself was an unfair process. So for example, let's look at an example. I've got an international student, and the professor is dismissive of questions that this student asks, and maybe an offhand remark was made about this student's accent. And then she gets a lower mark than everyone else, and she compares it with others, and she's just not satisfied that that decision was based upon the same criteria as everyone else, and begins to think it's not just tough luck, that it's actually unfair treatment, and that there was a pattern of decision making, of inconsistent grading, that leans towards it being unfair. So in this situation, the student would be justified in raising an appeal against that outcome, and this is an important issue to be aware of. However, you could have another student who's just unhappy with the result, and that's common. But if you're just unhappy, then that's unlikely to be unfair treatment. And so, understanding what counts as unfair treatment and what counts as treatment that you're not happy with is an important distinction to make. And so, recognizing genuine unfairness means that the proper process wasn't followed, and I'll look at that in later videos. So although something can be frustrating, it can be really disappointing, you need to look at whether that actual experience was unfair. And in doing that, you've got to look at the circumstances that you've experienced, and you've got to apply that to the policies and procedures of the university or college. So if you've experienced something like that, you should take action, okay? I've got a support service, UniResolution. You can reach out there. We'll do our best to support you. But also, it's important just to know that you're not alone and you deserve fair treatment.